Hey everyone, James here, bringing you another Italian genre film review. Today going to be talking about the Eurocrime Poliziotteschi film Kidnap Syndicate from 1975. This is a Fernando Di Leo film. It's probably not in the top 3 Fernando Di Leo films that you're going to get exposed to. That would definitely be the Milieu trilogy. But if you tend to want to go a little further, as I often do, especially if you liked what you see, I think this one will come up pretty shortly after. It is coming in terms of just his career right after Shoot First, Die Later. And I think this is actually a really good film. Personally, for me, this would probably make my Fernando Di Leo top 3. I think it's also really fun one to do after the Milieu trilogy because it is quite different, and it tackles a fairly different just side of kind of Eurocrime and Poliziotteschi. So I think it's interesting the way that it goes. And a couple things. First of all, this is a kidnapping film. I will be spoiling the film, so if you have not seen it, I do recommend people go check it out. I think this one's definitely worth checking out if you're a Eurocrime fan. But it feels very, very much inspired by Kurosawa's High and Low. This is a kidnapping film where basically 2 kids get taken, one rich, one poor. In fact, one interesting twist that the film puts into here, Di Leo puts, is that the poor kid only really gets taken because he tries to prevent the kidnapping of the richer kid's son, Filippini, and that kind of just adds this twist where he is punished almost for just trying to be a good person and doing something good. So it ends up going quite poorly. I feel like the kidnappings often go very poorly in these Italian films. You rarely see a absolute success. So I feel like the success rate of the kidnapping units is not very good during this time. And so inspired by High and Low, but another important thing is this is happening smack dab in the middle of the years of lead, a lot of political unrest, a lot of kidnappings going on here. And so we do get a lot of references to that too. So you can't solely say that this film is inspired by High and Low when it's definitely influenced by kind of some of the real systemic issues happening at the time. In fact, there are references that sort of the head inspector here, who is quite good in this film actually, it talks about in sense of like talking about different like kidnapping as a big business, which is the case for this film, but he also references political kidnapping, which he says is a totally different mess. And there was just a lot of that going on at the time in Italy. And so I think it's interesting to have that kind of like Italian realism grounded into kind of this pulpy B movie, tossing in a little bit of that Kurosawa High and Low, a film which I love. I don't think this film quite gets there as far as being as great as that film, but I think this film is really good and almost deserves to be in the conversation. It's much shorter, and I think something should be said for that, and it packs a lot into that basically 98-minute runtime, if I recall correctly. So the first half is very, very high and low. This is the part that feels very inspired, kind of plot-wise, by that Kurosawa film, especially in the sense of like sort of the ways that these 2 kids are kidnapped, but there are very disparate impacts here. And in fact, one issue and one theme that runs throughout this film is the way that a lot of characters want to basically treat these kidnapping as a business. In fact, the kidnappers see themselves this way. As we go through sort of their corporate structure, we see sort of the lower level employees, the mid-management, and then the people at the top at the very end. But so it's different from the Kurosawa film in the sense that that film had the villain is basically someone that saw the high mansion of Mifune's character and wants to kind of is envious and just hateful of that, rather than sort of being more of a big corporate system here that is working to basically kidnap rich kids and get the ransom payments for them. So in that sense, it is kind of different, and in a fairly interesting way, because it shows how one kid is worth a lot while the other kid is not worth anything. James Mason, who gives a great performance here playing Filippini, just as a totally despicable character, but not necessarily despicable in a way that he's like foaming from the mouth and stuff like that, but despicable in kind of just a very corrupt corporate way where he wants to present himself as good, but no one really trusts him, and for good reason. The guy is kind of a louse, and because he is basically in the power seat here, as opposed to Luke Miranda, who is playing Kalila and is basically sidelined for the first half of the film. He wants to treat it as an investment, or not an investment, a business thing. And so he is negotiating with the kidnappers by stalling and using lots of different tactics to make people wait and stuff like that in order to basically get that ransom money down, and so he doesn't have to pay the full 10 billion lira amount that they're asking for. So he's basically trying to get that negotiate them down, and as a result of his negotiating them down, they end up having to show that they're serious, and so they end up killing the poor kid, Kalela, who at one point the inspector says he isn't worth anything because he's not the kid of James Mason. So it's a really, really sad moment, perhaps the saddest, for me at least, in a Eurocrime film. I think it really does pack a strong emotional punch there. And so Luke Miranda, who I don't think is necessarily the best actor ever, I think this might be his absolute very best role, and he really does he does a good job of acting during these emotional moments, and then eventually sort of transitioning into the second half of the film, which is more on the system of kidnapping, in sort of exploring that structure, as well as a vigilante film with Miranda basically playing the lead there. But up until that point, the kidnapping and stuff like that is all dictated by the rich person who is Filippini. So I think that's really interesting, and definitely a little bit of a different twist to that high and low tale. Yeah, so I think Di Leo in particular is really good at, other people have said this, about making social commentary and examining sort of that subtext and the way that things interact without being too heavy-handed. I'm not going to say this is subtle, but it's a little bit more beneath the surface than just sort of beating your head over it. There's also a very good supporting performance here by Vittorio Caprioli, who is the lead commissioner, I guess, of this kidnapping unit, who is funny but also pretty effective. I think it's one of the better roles I've seen him in. I think he appears in a couple Di Leo films in similar sort of roles, and he has kind of his own comedy beat to him. Di Leo films are always have a bit of comedy in them, and for me, the comedy can be a little bit hit or miss. For me, it mostly works in this film. Otherwise, it's fair. Without that, I think this effort is a fairly negative film, a little bit dour, but I think having him around does help to. He's effective both in moving the plot along as well as sort of being the comic relief that goes on. So the second half of the film, I think, is just as interesting as the first half. For me, high and low, I think the first half is a little bit more interesting than the second half when we get into more of the solving crime part of it. So similar to that film, this first half is a lot more about the morality and the moral dilemmas facing the characters, and a lot of James Mason in there, which is all great. Second half is is in many ways a little bit more straightforward. So we're almost getting just two movies packed in there, and this is still only 98 minutes, so it's still very, very short. So the film, in my opinion, is not slow. It keeps moving and moving and moving towards that inevitable conclusion. And basically the second half is Kalela, now that his son has been killed, basically taking revenge and investigating his way up the ladder. And I don't know whether to credit Gastaldi or Di Leo here, or perhaps both, in terms of creating a very intricate and pretty well thought out organization to the Kidnap Syndicate, or the corporation that is basically commodifying kidnapping as a business and targeting certain people, rich businessmen, in order to basically extort and get the money from them. So Gastaldi, famous for his work in Jolly. I think he often tries to make stuff very, very logical, so it wouldn't shock me if he was responsible for thinking through some of that stuff there. I don't know, so I don't know for sure, but it's well thought through in the way that the corporate structure has a bunch of different layers to it. We see everything from sort of the lower level people that are doing sort of the grunt work involved, which includes people like an immigrant from the East is what they reference, so presumably from one of the Soviet provinces at the time, upwards to sort of your middle management, who deals with the grunts as well as with the upper management, who are basically in this office building in Milan, just doing the kidnap business as if it was just a totally legitimate business there. So we finally get introduced to that latter group at the very end. So I like the way that the film just slowly uncovers more and more of that. We basically get to go through, we basically identify the most with Kalela as he works his way up the organization, taking vengeance and trying to basically get to the very, very top of it. There's basically very little action for a Eurocrime film, especially in the first half. But the second half, it does pick up a bunch as Kalela does basically exact vigilante revenge. There's a great motorcycle chase sequence that happens. Otherwise, it's pretty action light compared to something like Shoot First, Die Later or Italian Connection, which both have longer action scenes going on. The Luis Bacalov score also kicks up here. He definitely is reusing a couple beats that I think come from Caliber 9 in this case, but they're really good. It's a really good score, so I actually don't really have much of an issue with it. When Bacalov gives you a score as great as that, I would not fault anyone for wanting to reuse it in a future film. They probably also did not foresee kind of the future of home video and thought these films were just kind of crank them out ones. So I think the second half is really, really effective. I do think it feels a little bit different from your sort of standard vigilante films, which often can be a little bit thoughtless in how and cartoonish in how it goes. I think it goes into a greater depth to build that sort of organizational structure within the business of kidnapping, as well as just kind of direct you through Miranda's mindset as it goes. Like we see, we are kind of in agony with him as the kidnapping process happens. So I think we do sympathize a great deal with him as he does actually exact vigilante justice. So it feels a less like a sort of like those Eurocrime films that are very easily accused of being fascist. Probably more stereotypically the ones with Maurizio Merli, and perhaps directed by Umberto Lenzi, which are very much romps where Merli is almost a psychopath, just taking, just reaping, just beating up and killing low-life criminals who are even more despicable than he is. So in that sense, this film feels very, very different from those, and less cartoonish than perhaps Death Wish goes. So I really like this film. I think it's great. This is my second time viewing it. I wasn't sure how well it would hold up, but I think it's definitely one of my favorite Di Leo films. Definitely coming in a little bit behind Italian Connection, but perhaps tied with something like Caliber 9 for second or third place. So who won? Gonna give this to Luc Miranda, who I think is excellent in the role. Usually my temptation is always to give it to the director here, but I think in this case, it's such a strong role that I want to give it to him. Rating, gonna come in at a 9 out of 10. I originally had given this film an 8 out of 10 when I saw it for the first time in early 2020. Now, with a rewatch, I think it holds up super well, so 9 out of 10. I'll see y'all next time.